you all that you need, but I'll give you all I can feel. I can give you all that you need, but I'll give you all I can feel. Say you know every day you are someone. Pray down and you pray, hoping something comes your way. You wanna love someone, love someone. I can give you all that you need, but I'll give you all I can feel. I can give you all that you need, but I'll give you all you can feel. I can give you all that you need, but I'll give you all I can feel. I can give you all that you need, but I'll give you all I can feel. All right, let's make a start. So I'm just going to dive straight back in where we left off last week. I'll start off recapping some of the main points from the first half of last week's lecture and then drill into this idea of the distinction between direct and indirect consequentialism. And that'll be roughly the first half of the lecture. Then in the second half, we're going to switch gears and talk about this criticism that comes out in the Bernard Williams article. He's arguing that consequentialism somehow threatens our integrity. So we'll try to get a sense of what that criticism is really driving at, and then think a little bit right at the end about different strategies that consequentialists might take to try to accommodate the so-called personal point of view. So, by now you're all very confident about precisely what consequentialism is. It's the family of ethical theories that defines right and wrong action in terms of good or bad outcomes. So an action is right if it promotes the good or demotes the bad. An action is wrong if it promotes the bad or demotes the good. Pretty simple schematic definition. Then we're going to have different kinds of consequentialist theories within this overarching family based on different accounts that we might give of what the good or the bad actually consists in. So the most well-known consequentialist theory is classical utilitarianism, defended by a number of people, most famously Jeremy Bentham. And classical utilitarians think that what's good is pleasure or happiness, and what's bad is suffering or unhappiness. Over time, consequentialists have looked at that particular theory of good and bad and felt dissatisfied with it, felt that that's not a rich enough conception of the good, and offered alternative conceptions of the good that try to build in other kinds of considerations to do with autonomy or preference, or maybe just some objective standards of what flourishing or well-being might involve. Okay, consequentialists tell us to promote the good rather than to merely honour it or respect it or cherish it. So that means you might be in a situation where your conception of the good is human welfare, human well-being, and more human well-being would be achieved in the long term if you did something that was very bad with respect to human well-being right now, like killing one person to save a bunch of others. Consequentialists say you should make those kinds of trade-offs. You should always aim to promote the good outcomes overall, rather than honouring the ideal of human welfare, which might, in that particular instance, compel you to not kill a person to save others. It's always about promoting the good. But then there's this question whether we should try to maximise the good, that's one way of promoting it, or be satisficers. Does anyone remember from last week what that distinction is trying to track? Yeah? Yep, spot on. So both of these people fall within the broad family of consequentialist theories. They both agree that we have to promote the good, but the satisficer will say there's some level of, having done enough to promote the good, after which point you get a tick. your behaviour counts as right, even if you could have done more to promote the good. Where the maximizer, in a certain sense, thinks you can never really do enough. There's always something more that you could do. Okay, objective and subjective consequentialists disagree about what makes an action right or wrong, whether it's based on the actual outcome or the expected outcome of your action. So very quickly, can anyone think of a case, or just give us a schematic sketch of a case where this distinction is going to lead you to different judgments about whether or not an action was right or wrong? Does anyone remember the hostage negotiator example I gave in the last lecture? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So we're not omniscient. We can't see the future. You might be in a situation where you reasonably believe that following choice A is going to result in better consequences, but then you get unlucky and an unlikely consequence of your action unfolds, and what you did results in worse consequences than if you'd done the other thing. But the subjective consequentialist is going to say you still acted rightly because the expected benefit of your action was kind of maximal or optimific, whereas the objective consequentialist is going to say you acted wrongly. Okay, very briefly, why do people like consequentialist theories? This is just recapping from last week. One is that they're simple. Every ethical theory pays some attention to the consequences of our action and thinks that that has some bearing on whether we act rightly or wrongly. Consequentialists are distinguished by virtue of the fact that they think that's all that matters, whereas deontologists think that we also have to pay attention to rights and duties. Virtue theorists think we also have to pay attention to virtues like kindness or courage, or vices like cruelty. So consequentialism, there's no kind of thing that it has to theorize and deal with that its rivals don't also have to deal with, but its rivals have different kinds of conceptual sort of spaces that they have to fill out and theorize, and consequentialism doesn't have to deal with any of those things, so that makes it theoretically simpler. That's one thing that people have liked about it. Another thing that people have liked about it is that it's flexible. What do we mean by saying it's flexible? We mean that in situations like that case that we looked at last week, you're on the desert island and you make a promise to your friend and then only you get rescued. You promise to give the money to the jockey club. Well, if after the promise has been made, you find yourself in a situation where you can do much more good and much more benefit by breaking the promise and giving the money to some other organisation that needs it more, most of us have the intuition that at least sometimes you should break the promise and do the thing that has more benefit, that sort of categorically holding on to every promise and commitment you ever make sometimes doesn't really make sense, ethically speaking. And consequentialism is the ethical theory that can best make sense of that intuitive sense that we ought to sometimes be flexible in our commitments, that in fact it's ethically appropriate, ethically preferable to be flexible like that. And lastly, consequentialism has this kind of radical, unbiased way of approaching the world. I mentioned last week that consequentialists have been at the vanguard of a bunch of different kind of dramatic reformist social movements. I'll just mention one of them briefly, which is animal rights. Why have consequentialists been more concerned with, more kind of motivated and mobilized to prioritize the needs and the welfare of animals than proponents of other kinds of ethical views? Well, it's because of the way that they approach questions of right action. Right? They say, happiness matters, suffering matters. Doesn't matter who the suffering happens to. All that matters is that we minimize suffering, right? And then we start understanding the physiology and the neurology of animals better than we have in the past, and we realize, hang on, when they screech and yowl and behave in negative ways, it's actually the reasonable thing to think about that behavior is that it's relevantly similar in terms of what's going on in their subjective experience to what we experience. And there's no reason to think that their suffering matters any less than ours just because it's happening inside a chimp's head rather than a human's head. So consequentialists, because they just zero in on that one thing, we're just concerned about minimizing suffering, it means they have a more sort of, what's the word for it, a kind of disregard for conventional social and ethical mores, right? All you people think animals don't matter anywhere near as much as humans, but I'm here to tell you all that matters at the end of the day is suffering. And that the way that their theory inclines them towards radical social movements aimed at looking after the welfare of historically oppressed groups or species, as the case may be, is something that's consistently drawn people to consequentialism. seeing in it the promise of a kind of emancipatory politics. Okay, now, here's the problem where we finished last week. I like cake and I like whiskey and I want to eat and drink things that make me happy, so should I eat cake and drink whiskey? Well, suppose I'm just thinking about this in a consequentialist way. All that I'm concerned about at the end of the day is maximizing my happiness, right? And obviously cake and whiskey can benefit my happiness in the short term, but if I eat cake every day and drink whiskey every day, I could end up alcoholic or diabetic or worse, right? So what am I to do? Every day when the decision arises, shall I eat cake today, shall I drink whiskey today, how do I make my decision, try to balance these benefits against these costs? The problem, as I said last week, is consequentialism tells us to do whatever is going to have the most benefit, and so we then approach the decision in a way that's just focusing on the costs and benefits, right? But because of the sort of psychological dispositions we have, because of various biases and heuristics that are not quite hardwired, but almost hardwired into our cognitive habits, we're very, very bad at making consistently good decisions, right? If I wake up every day and think, shall I have cake today? Will that benefit my happiness overall in the long run? It's really, really easy for me to make the wrong decision and have cake too often and then end up threatening my health, right? Beings with psychologies like ours often do much, much better just following really simple rules and guidelines and codes of conduct. So if I have a rule that's something like, eat lean meat and vegetables for most meals and only have cake and whiskey once a fortnight, then probably in the long run I'm going to do a much better job at maximizing my health and happiness and kind of consuming an amount of cake and whiskey that is sort of giving me some happiness because I get to have nice things every now and then, but not so much that it leads me into suffering in the long run. Okay, so that's the relatively trivial, simple case, but then we see how parallels emerge in really morally grave situations like questions about when, if ever, we should use torture as a means of trying to prevent bad outcomes. Again, suppose we're just thinking about this in a purely consequentialist way. So we're only going to torture people in that very, very small number of cases. Indeed, there might be no real-world cases. It might only be hypothetical cases. But we're only prepared to torture people if we have good reason to think that doing so will minimize suffering and promote, human welfare overall. Of course, torture inflicts terrible suffering now, but there might be some cases, very, very occasionally, where we can torture some information out of a person that will enable us to prevent a tragedy in which much, much worse outcomes would have eventuated. So again, the question is, how are we going to make our decisions, case by case? And the worry about consequentialism is that it gives us a theory of right action. It tells us to do whatever promotes the best outcomes, that when that gets activated in people who have our kind of psychological biases and heuristics, means we very often just get the decision badly wrong, right? We miscalculate the likelihood of conferring a significant benefit in this particular case, and we end up doing more harm than good. And again, similar to the last case, we often do much better if we just follow a really simple rule, like never torture anyone ever, no matter what. Okay. So what are we to do with this? We know that consequentialists want to define right action in terms of the good. They want to say an action is right if it promotes the good and bad if it demotes the good. But that's just a theory of right action. And one kind of response to these worries that consequentialists have defended is to say we should just separate out our theory of right action from a separate theory which we're going to use to govern how we deliberate and make decisions. Just treat them as two separate things. So in the Pettit article from last week, this is just a very brief quote where he makes this point. He says a consequentialist theory should be thought of an account of what justifies an option over alternatives, the fact that it promotes the relevant value, not an account of how agents ought to deliberate. Right? You say to the consequentialist, how should agents decide which course of action to take? You're telling them that the right action is the one that promotes the best consequences, but how should they judge that? How should they decide case from case which action they should in fact do? Nowadays, what most consequentialists want to say is that, well, deliberating and deciding are themselves kinds of actions. There's the action itself that you're trying to make a decision about, but then the process of deliberating about that action is also an action. And you should deliberate and decide in whatever way is most likely to result in you performing the action that you ought to perform so as to get good consequences. Right? So if that example about torture, if the claim I've made about our psychological dispositions there is right, if it's true that if we try to make case-by-case judgments of costs and benefits, that generally we get it wrong and we end up doing much more harm than good, then the consequentialist is going to say, that's a bad decision procedure for that case, and we should use a different decision procedure. But we should use whatever decision procedure is the best one in consequentialist terms, and we're going to treat that as a separate question from how we define right action. Okay, does that distinction make sense? You've got a theory of right action and a decision procedure for making choices about how you're going to act, and those two things can just be held apart. Any questions about that? Because it's about to get a little bit more complicated. All right, good. So let's dive into the complication. There are lots of different ways that you can, so to speak, go indirect when you're a consequentialist, right? In some sense or other, you're going to think consequences decide everything, but there are different ways that you can think about attacking those consequences, aiming at those consequences, either directly in the short term or indirectly in the long term. So the decision procedure is one, right? You can adopt an indirect decision procedure. And as I said, nowadays that's what most consequentialists want to do. But you might also consider adopting an indirect theory about right action itself, right? So now we've set aside the decision procedure. We've granted that, yeah, we probably want to make decisions via this kind of indirect method. But how should we define right action itself? We have to define right action in terms of the consequences of our actions, but we can still think about how our actions have their consequences in direct or indirect ways. And the clearest way to see this is to just give you an example of a direct and an indirect theory of right action. So a direct theory, act consequentialists would say an act is right just if it promotes best consequences. Rule consequentialists would say an act is right if it complies with a rule of conduct whose general acceptance would promote best consequences. So this has got nothing to do with decision procedures at this point. This is just two different ways that you could theorize what makes an action right. Both of them are consequentialist because they both define right action in terms of consequences, but they differ as to which consequences we're paying attention to, right? The consequences that follow immediately from your act, or the consequences that follow from the rule which you're abiding by. So it's not too difficult to think of cases where the act consequentialist and the rule consequentialist are going to reach different verdicts about not just how you should decide, but also what the right action actually is, right? Suppose we're in one of those very, very rare torture cases that maybe only ever actually really happen in fiction, like in the show 24, where there is a suspect, they know some information which if we could get it out of them, we could use to prevent a tragedy like where the bomb is planted, and we've got effective enhanced interrogation, i.e. torture techniques at our disposal, right? If you torture them, the expected outcome is that you'll get some information which will enable you to prevent a disaster. And if you prevent that disaster, the benefits will be much greater than the cost of inflicting grave suffering on this person. Set aside the question of how we deliberate about this, and just think about the question, what's the right action? The act consequentialist and the rule consequentialist disagree about that, right? The act consequentialist is going to say, if you torture, you'll do more good than harm, and that's just what makes an action right, is doing more good than harm. If the choice is torture or not torture, then the right choice is to torture. The rule consequentialist is going to say, that's not the right action because the right action is one that complies with a rule, which if we all followed it generally all of the time, things would go better. And the rule that's going to promote good consequences is never torture anyone, right? A rule that says torture people only if the benefits outweigh the cost, if we all sort of made that the rule that guided our conduct, we'd all, because of these kinds of tendencies to misjudge the costs and benefits in particular cases, we'd run this really grave risk of just torturing in all sorts of cases where it didn't benefit anyone. Indeed, you might think that's exactly what happened when the United States and their allies started appealing to consequentialist justifications to justify enhanced interrogation techniques in the wake of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s, right? So the act consequentialist and the rule consequentialist here aren't just disagreeing about how we make our decisions, they're disagreeing about what makes an action right in the first place. Okay. Now, rule consequentialism is a view that plenty of people have found appealing because if you can make it work, it gives you the best of both worlds. You get the simplicity of consequentialism. Everything ultimately rests on whether it promotes good consequences, but you also avoid this rather unpalatable result that standard act consequentialism generates. The unpalatable result being that you can lie and torture and steal and betray your nearest and dearest friends and do anything else bad that you might think of in a case where the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs. Right? Rule consequentialism can accommodate the fairly resilient intuition that most of us have that morality can't sort of license you in doing bad things anytime the ends justify the means, but it can still situate itself within this broadly, consequentialist framework with some of the benefits that that has in terms of simplicity and so forth. Moreover, if we've followed the rough consensus amongst consequentialists and granted that our decision procedure should be an indirect one, right? We should follow rules of thumb or, the advice of wise people rather than simply trying to calculate costs and benefits in each case. If we've granted that point, which many consequentialists accept, then another nice thing about rule consequentialism is that it sort of harmonizes with that. Now we have a theory of right action. Right action is one that accords with the rules that sort of have the best benefits. That corresponds neatly with our decision procedure, which is decide how you're going to act by following, rules of thumb or norms that overall promote good consequences. That harmony is another nice thing. You end up with a view where basically our decisions are governed by rules. Maybe those rules can even be inscribed in laws or codes of conduct. But what justifies the whole system is that it promotes good consequences. Seems like a sort of best of both worlds view, right? So why isn't everyone just a rule consequentialist? Or at least, why isn't every consequentialist a rule consequentialist? So I will explain by constructing a dialogue in which I will play both parts. Yesterday I tried to get one of these online little animation things where you make little avatar characters have a conversation with each other, and I wasted half an hour trying to make it work, and I couldn't make it work. So I will just play both characters. It would have been so sweet if it worked, but I'm not tech savvy enough. Okay, so AC, this is the act consequentialist. The act consequentialist is over this side of the room. And imagine there's a rule, set up. There's a person over here who's a rule consequentialist, and because they're a rule consequentialist, they think the rule that generally promotes best outcomes is telling the truth. Honesty is the best policy, right? So they've been involved in some kind of harsh emotional situation with a really good friend of both people and have decided to be honest about how they feel about something and that to really hurt the other person's feelings. And probably if they just told a little white lie or kind of softened the blow a little bit, the person would be feeling much better now, but they're committed to telling the truth. And the act consequentialist says to them, why are you telling the truth in this situation? What are you doing? You're hurting our friend. You're doing so much damage. Why can't you just tell a little white lie? The rule consequentialist says, well, I think the right action to perform in any case is the one that if there was a general rule of conduct and we all followed it, in most cases, that would promote the best consequences. And I think honesty really is the best policy. Yeah, it's hurting them now, but that's the way we should generally live our lives, to promote good consequences. So, I am thinking about the consequences, but I'm approaching them indirectly, right? We agree that the consequences matter. I'm just trying to approach it differently. And then the act consequentialist gets a bit kind of Socratic and philosophical, and they say, all right, let me stop you there. Just to be clear, the only reason you have for following this rule is that you think it promotes best consequences. That's what you're telling me, right? You don't think that there's some other kind of transcendental metaphysical factor that obliges you to follow this rule. You just think the rule is good because it promotes good consequences, yeah? And the rule consequentialist says, yeah, I am a consequentialist. That's my only reason for following this rule or liking this rule in the first place. I think it promotes good consequences. And now the act consequentialist strikes and they say, If that's your only reason for following the rule, then you just shouldn't follow the rule in this case, right? Because the reason that you appeal to explain to yourself why you should follow the rule, promoting good consequences, in this case, you'd do better by the lights of that reason to just violate the rule. Look, if you're really worried about it, if you're worried that by violating the rule you'll somehow undermine people's general allegiance to this rule, just do it in secret. Just don't tell anyone that you're telling lies. Just lie in secret. And keep going around publicly saying we should all tell the truth all the time, right? Because, again, your only reason for caring about this rule is to promote good consequences, and you do better at that by your own light, in this particular case, if you just told a lie, yeah? So the rule consequentialist is a little bit rattled, and they say, well, yeah, okay, I see your point, act consequentialist, but I still think that this way of approaching decisions of just trying to calculate costs and benefits in every case, I don't think this is going to go well. I don't think thinking about right action in that way is puts us on a footing to understand, how we really should act in different cases, right? So maybe we can have a rule that generally you tell the truth, but we have some exceptions built in, so that in the case where things would really go a lot better by lying, the rule permits you. That's kind of how the rule works. And now the act consequentialist is just exasperated and smug, and they say, but that's not a rule at all. A rule that says never lie unless it's beneficial to lie is not a rule against lying, right? It's just an act consequentialist idea, which is do whatever promotes the best consequences. So it turns out all along you were just an act consequentialist like me. So the worry is that to try to make sense of rule consequentialism, either you end up having to fetishize the rules and just treat them as these inviolable norms, which kind of loses contact with the consequentialist reasons you had for favouring them in the first place, or if you don't fetishize the rules, then it just collapses back into act consequentialism. Question?
What if the rule consequentialists use the harm being done by political as trivial in the long term, in the grand scheme of things? Because, yes, the consequentialist says you're doing everything for the greatest good, which is a utilitarian principle.
Yeah.
But if you look at it that, you can't say that this one individual person being harmed, and this case, a small amount, let's get into people's hurt, it's not going to make the rest of the world and the whole of history bad.
That's true.
Just make that person bad and innocent, then they can overcome it because they have sort of control over their oppression. So they can argue at the point where the second AC thing, they can argue instead of saying accept, they can just say, well, the harm was trivial, therefore the will be more for them because the harm was trivial.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you really thought that the harm just was trivial in the sense that it doesn't even register on the consequentialist calculus, then plausibly that does give you a way to kind of stick to your rule. But you can kind of guess what the act consequentialist might press back on here, and they'd say, there are going to be cases where I'm going to hold your feet to the fire and where the harms aren't trivial. By your own lights, the harms aren't trivial. And in those cases, if you're calling yourself a rule consequentialist, you're going to have to deal with this kind of tension. Either you just do fetishize the rule, or you collapse back into being an act consequentialist. So if it were the case that all of these conflicts involved negligible or trivial harms, then maybe the rule consequentialist is going to carry the day. But as soon as we get a case where they accept, no, these harms aren't trivial, then they're back in this kind of uneasy bind. So what's the right position to take? What sort of consequentialist should you be? Well, the jury is out even amongst consequentialists. A rough sense of how the dialectic stacks up. I mean, proponents of these two different approaches agree that everything comes down to consequences. The rule consequentialist's main concern is that thinking about right action in an act consequentialist way kind of conditions our moral perspective, puts us on a footing towards others where we're likely to make these kinds of serious moral mistakes. It's a kind of a scary world, one where people think, yeah, you should torture or lie or do anything anytime the benefits outweigh the costs. And indeed, it's not just a scary world, it's a world where things go worse in precisely the way that consequentialists of most familiar kinds, ones who care about human welfare or flourishing in any familiar sense, are going to object to, right? It's going to be the kind of world where we have, you know, torture programs that just get out of control because the people running them become sort of delusional about the likely benefits of torturing in lots of cases. Okay, so the rule consequentialist is going to pressure the act consequentialist about this stuff. The act consequentialist is going to pressure the rule consequentialist by kind of pointing out the incoherence of the kind of motivational perspective that you've got to occupy as a rule consequentialist. You've got to somehow treat these rules as categorically binding, but as consequentialist, your only reason for liking the rules in the first place is because you think they do more benefit than harm. And so in the cases where they don't, treating the rules as kind of absolutely authoritative is sort of losing contact with the whole consequentialist rationale that's supposed to underpin your ethical theory. Right? As I said, the jury's out. This is a live issue amongst consequentialists where they try to sort of gerrymander different kinds of hybrid views that get the best of both worlds. One view that I'll just mention briefly, which was, I suppose, invented by Sidgwick, who's a famous utilitarian of the early 20th century, is what he called government house utilitarianism. And the idea here is that we have a bunch of rule architects, like legislators, who come up with social rules which, if everyone followed them, would generally go pretty well. And their perspective on the rules is, we are going to have these rules because they promote good consequences, but they don't tell the people that. They tell the people that the rules are just categorically binding them, and it's always wrong to violate them no matter what. They don't tell the people, these are good rules because they promote the good. They say, these are just the rules that you ought to follow, period. And it's supposed to be justified in consequentialist terms, but the psychology of the folk who are following the rules is, we just follow these rules because it's absolutely categorically wrong to torture or whatever. And Sidgwick thought this was a way that you could get the best of both worlds, but you can see kind of the downside of it. You have this weird divided society where there's architects of the social rules and then just a bunch of sheep who are expected to follow them blindly. Okay, so live question, how consequentialists should manage this problem. Let's talk about now a different kind of problem, and this is not so much a intra-theoretical debate, but this is something that people who don't identify with consequentialism, standing outside of it, want to, you know, throw against it as an external objection. The issue is about integrity. So I'm just going to read this story from Bernard Williams' article, which is in the Reader on page 98, about Jim and the Indians. Some of you might have read this and found the kind of colonialist setting of the story a little bit on the nose, and the way that the sort of South American locals are referred to as Indians. Obviously, the writing is of its time and has some of the kind of echoes of colonialism that now we look at and find a bit unpalatable. But this has been a kind of very influential way of thinking about this problem that consequentialism runs into about integrity. So, Jim and the Indians. Jim finds himself in the central square of a small South American town. Tied up against the wall are a row of 20 Indians, most terrified, a few defiant. In front of them, several armed men in uniform. A heavy man in a sweat-stained khaki shirt turns out to be the captain in charge, and after a good deal of questioning of Jim, which establishes that he got there by accident while on a botanical expedition, explains that the Indians are a random group of the inhabitants who, after recent attacks of protest against the government, are just about to be killed to remind other possible protesters of the advantages of not protesting. In other words, they're just going to be killed to make an example of them and show that the colonial governors have all the power and weapons. However, since Jim is an honoured visitor from another land, the captain is happy to offer him a guest's privilege of killing one of the Indians himself. If Jim accepts, then as a special mark of the occasion, the other Indians will be let off. Of course, if Jim refuses, then there is no special occasion, and Pedro here will do what he was about to do when Jim arrived and kill them all. Jim, with some desperate recollection of schoolboy fiction, wonders whether if he got hold of a gun, he could hold the captain, Pedro, and the rest of the soldiers to threat, but it is quite clear from the setup that nothing of the kind is going to work. Any attempt at that sort of thing will mean that all the Indians will be killed, and himself. The men against the wall and the other villagers understand the situation and are obviously begging him to accept. What should he do? So the consequentialist has a very simple answer to what he should do. He should kill the one guy and save 19 people's lives. Indeed, everyone who's there is begging for him to do it. But Williams, in telling this story, is trying to activate a recalcitrant intuition, an intuition that says, I don't feel okay about doing that. The consequentialist thinks it's so obvious what I should do, but I'm not. To me, it doesn't feel obvious that I can just, in a situation like that, be justified, permitted, let alone obliged to kill one person. An initial explanation of this is that whether or not we perform some action or make some choice, for most of us, is not merely a question of what outcomes will we make it the case, right? It's also a question of what kind of person am I prepared to be? What sort of choices can I make? What is my identity? And what sorts of actions can I perform consistently with sort of having that identity? If I'm a radical pacifist, if I've made an absolute commitment to non-violence, both in my life and as a kind of political stance, right? Then the consequentialist's prescription, kill this guy to save 19, might be ineligible for me. That's a very kind of familiar and normal way of thinking about the relationship between our choices and our commitments. And as Williams tells us, this is closely linked to the idea of integrity, the idea of being a person with a particular set of projects and commitments or ideals which give structure, coherence, and meaning to one's choices. Being an integrated self, a whole, complete, and consistent self. Typically, we understand that as sort of something that revolves around having certain ideals and projects and commitments, and the consequentialist is going to tell us that that's all well and good, but as soon as you find yourself in a situation where abandoning those commitments would lead to better outcomes, that's what you should do. That flexibility that looked like an advantage in some situations, like Smart's example of the desert island, starts to look like actually a cost ethically speaking, because it alienates us from an important part of our ethical lives. Now, there's a simplistic way to read all this, and to think that Williams is just kind of balking at the demandingness of consequentialism. Yeah, being a consequentialist, given a sort of, a plausible theory of the good as somehow being to do with maximizing welfare or minimizing suffering, sometimes that's going to put you in a situation where you've got to get your hands dirty. And you could read Williams as just saying, oh, but I don't like that. I don't want my hands to be dirty. I don't want to have to do nasty things. That makes me feel sad about being a nasty man or something. But so you could read Williams that way, and indeed some who are unfriendly to the points he's trying to make here have read him that way. But I think we should try to dig just a little bit deeper down into the substance of the point that he's making here, right? It's not just that he thinks that, consequentialism sometimes is a bit hard and makes you feel a bit gross. So the first point that Williams is trying to make is one that he's sort of making a general concession to an important part of consequentialist thought. He's saying, look, let's grant, I think it's reasonable to grant that, whether or not we're consequentialists, in some doctrinaire way, most of us are trying to live lives that in some sense promote the good. Some kind of good states of affairs that we could articulate if we were forced to think about it and spell it all out. But as we learned in week 2 when we were looking at Butler's response to psychological egoism, promoting the good, promoting welfare or happiness, in most cases isn't just about going out there and gobbling up the good. You don't wake up in the morning and think, how shall I inaugurate goodness in the world today, right? Rather, we have projects and commitments that we use to try to promote the good indirectly, right? I think that the arts makes people happier, so I'm going to invest in trying to be a musician or an artist. I think that knowledge edifies us and helps us live better and helps us get technology that improves our lives, so I'm going to try to invest in knowledge. I'm going to try to be a great engineer or a great philosopher, right? I think that harmony and community and good social relations is how we, sort of advance as humans and live better lives. So I'm going to go into politics, or I'm going to be a community leader. We could multiply examples all day. In Williams's article, this is just a paraphrase. He mentions a few things like making other people happy is one of the kinds of commitments that we have to try to pursue happiness itself indirectly. Careers or committing to organizations or certain causes. He says we don't pursue happiness as such. We pursue other worthwhile things which conduce to happiness. And he's not saying this as a kind of an anti-consequentialist thought. He's saying This is how the consequentialist, him or herself, should understand the ideal of trying to pursue welfare or happiness or any kind of thing that they might plausibly identify as whatever the intrinsic good is. Right? We don't just go there and try to gobble it up directly. We promote the good through the pursuit of other kinds of commitments and ideals and projects. Now, that's the setup. Here's the objection. Williams says, it is absurd to demand of someone, when the sums come in from the utility network which the projects of others have in part determined, that he should just step aside from his own project and decision and acknowledge the decision which utilitarian calculation requires. It is to alienate him in a real sense from his actions and the source of his action in his own convictions. It is to make him into a channel between the input of everyone's project, including his own, and an output of optimific decision. It's a little bit dense, but here's what I think is the key idea that he's trying to get across here. Someone's projects are setting the agenda here. Someone's projects are defining the choice situation that everyone else finds themselves in. And if I let Pedro, this psychotic colonial captain who's prepared to slaughter 20 people just to make a point, if I let his choice scenario, like he's dictating choices to me, if you do this, then this will happen, and if you don't do this, this will happen. If I let his projects and his ideals set up the choice scenario and just kind of acquiesce to that, something's gone really wrong, morally speaking. It can't be that I'm just required to let him dictate terms like that. If you emphasize the contrast that's come out in this passage and in other parts of the article between the choices of others and my own choices, the projects of others and my own projects, right? The theme that Williams is trying to emphasize here is one about how, sort of who gets to be the author of the moral situation in which we find ourselves. And what he's trying to tell us is that what he's trying to object to consequentialism in is saying that consequentialists tell us to just evacuate all of our own projects and commitments from the situation and let other people's commitments and projects decide then what choices we have in front of us. And he's saying it shouldn't be like that. Sometimes, indeed, not just generally speaking, if we're committed to promoting the good, it actually requires us to try to be the one dictating terms to others, right? And holding on to those projects categorically. So it's ultimately a worry about moral autonomy, right? When Williams is talking about integrity, he's not just talking about our moral scruples, this sense that many of us have that it would be unfortunate if I found myself in a situation where I had to do something that really didn't sit rightly with me, right? It's a theory about how sort of human progress, if you like, actually works, and Williams thinks it works by people having those scruples, having those commitments and being prepared to stick to them no matter the situation they find themselves in and the projects and commitments that other people are trying to impose onto the situation. Now, one dimension of this point that you can kind of tease out is about responsibility, right? So think about, imagine Jim refuses to kill the guy and then Pedro does what he said he was going to do and kills 20 people. And someone comes up to Jim afterwards and says, Jim, you bastard, you're responsible for those 20 people dying. You could have saved 19 of them. Jim, so Williams is saying, ought to say, get stuffed, that's not my fault. I am not the one who is responsible for this bad. Take it up with Pedro, right? I'm a radical pacifist. I've got a project for, bringing good outcomes into the world, and it involves an unstinting commitment to radical non-violence, both as a personal creed and as a political program. If you want to blame someone for the 19 people who got killed, Pedro's right over there, right? I'm not going to let him sort of dictate my choices and then make me potentially responsible for something that he's chosen to do. That's one element of it here. You can emphasize that point about responsibility. But then there's this other aspect which is more about universalizing the ethos, thinking, well, what would happen if everyone thought the way that the consequentialist tells us to think? If everyone was prepared to just evacuate their own commitments and projects and let other people's commitments and projects dictate terms and dictate the choice situation that we find ourselves in, right? Williams actually thinks by the consequentialist's own light, they shouldn't want to live in a world like that. Because then the only people who are kind of setting up projects and holding commitments that dictate terms for other people are the people who don't give a stuff about morality, right? The moral people are just going around saying, well, if you're telling me that's the threat, then I guess I better do this. While the people who are kind of dictating choices to others are just like, cool, you know, I'm going to clean up. This is easy, right? He thinks that morally, being in the world in a sort of a morally edifying way requires us to have these commitments, and it requires us to really treat them as commitments. So again, that flexibility, which consequentialists themselves wanted to appeal to and say, this is the thing you should like about our theory, Williams is saying, no, 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 no. A world of flexible people is a world where the kind of malicious and antisocial people can just do what they want and get away with it. Yes. So we've got one fan of Williams here. Good. I like Williams as well. But consequentialists are going to want to say, hey, it's not quite as bad as you're making out, right? You're making out that we can't do anything to accommodate these personal ideals that you think, Williams, you think we have to have these kind of strong commitments in order to make the world a better place. Okay, we can actually accommodate some of that within our consequentialist system. So what sort of strategies might you adopt to try to fit it in? Well, there's a few options here. None of them are obviously sort of complete winners, but there's a few things that consequentialists, a few kind of strategic moves they can make here. One is to just try to go social. So instead of thinking that the responsibility falls to each of us as individuals to try to solve the worst problems of suffering in the world, try to create social systems that will take the burden off of us. So to understand why this would help, think about the situation that all of us are in. We're living in a world where there is appalling suffering, 1 to 2 billion people living in poverty, depending on whose figures you follow. And each of us could choose to pursue careers that maximize our earning potential and give as much money as we possibly can to causes that effectively combat that poverty, right? So none of us should seriously consider careers that are about aesthetic fulfillment or the attainment of knowledge or just exercising our skills, or certainly not like raising a family. Are you crazy, right? All the money that you're going to spend sending your kid to Haileybury, right? You could just give that to, malaria nets and save 7,000 lives. But what the consequentialist is going to say is, it's not as bad as that, right? We can and indeed we do set up social systems that try to take the burden off of us, so we can all make some contribution to remedying those problems, but also still have space to live lives of our own and to have those commitments, right? And if we choose to make frivolous commitments, so be it. But equally, we can, in that sort of morally autonomous space, we can choose to make commitments that are sort of aiming to further those same kind of socially progressive goals. Okay, the worry here is that that might guard us against certain kinds of systemic burdens, but we could still wind up in a case like Jim and the Indians, right? I don't have to abandon my goal of being a philosopher or a composer or a fantastic parent in order to earn money on Wall Street and give it to the poor, but I could still find myself in a situation where someone is trying to coerce my choices and make me do something that, violates a core moral commitment of mine. And these kind of neat social systems that the consequentialist is imagining aren't going to insulate me against that problem. So my integrity is still under threat even if we make this move. Another move the consequentialist could make is to say, all right, you're worried about moral autonomy. I'm going to bake that idea of moral autonomy into my conception of the good. So it's not that I'm worried about human welfare and you're worried about this other thing, moral autonomy, which kind of can't be accommodated in my theory of human good. I'm going to say that human welfare partly incorporates a recognition of people's moral autonomy. So that means there's going to be some cases where the cost to a person's moral autonomy, maybe Jim and the Indians is a case like this, is such that he actually shouldn't kill the one person, because then his good is so catastrophically defeated that, you do the consequentialist calculus and it comes out such that he shouldn't make that decision. Or even if you think 20 lives is too many, moral autonomy can't be worth that much, it at least gets some kind of weighting in the calculus and can affect what's right and wrong. So the worry there is just going to be about, whether it's really plausible to regard moral autonomy in the relevant sense as something that's intrinsically good. Remember, your theory of the good, if you're a consequentialist, has to be a theory of what's intrinsically good, the kind of thing that's good not because of its connection to any other positive thing, not because it promotes some good outcome or causally leads to some good outcome, things that are good in and of themselves. And trying to build moral autonomy into your conception of the good just invites this reply, which is, well, why should we think moral autonomy is intrinsically good, right? Naturally, we thought that moral autonomy was good where it was good because it leads people to live happier or better lives. So I need some more explanation as to how that could actually be an element of the good rather than merely something that conduces to it. Okay, last point is to say maybe this is not just a problem for consequentialism, right? So maybe the proponent of consequentialism accepts that, yeah, being in a situation like Jim and the Indians is a bit of a, horrible dilemma to be in, but it's a horrible dilemma whatever your ethical theory is, and horrible dilemmas are going to arise whatever your ethical theory is. There's no ethical theory that will fully protect your integrity as a moral being if you're in a world where you can wind up in situations like this. Okay, then the question is going to be, and this is a question that we're going to sort of tease out over the next few weeks looking at deontology, how do different ethical theories issue their demands to us? So it's true that every ethical theory imposes demands on us, demands that might, in certain unpleasant situations, like Jim and the Indians, alienate us from our own values, make us feel crap, make us feel like, this sort of moral residue follows us around. We're all going to be placed under severe demands sometimes by our moral theory. But how do different moral theories make their demands on us, right? What Williams and other critics of consequentialism have tried to argue is that the way that the demands come to us from a consequentialist theory alienates us from our own ideals and projects. But other ethical theories don't necessarily alienate us in the same way. Deontological theories are all built around an ideal of reason. And if you think, as deontologists do, but indeed we all might sort of think they're onto something here, that human beings are, by their very nature, reason-governed creatures, that's what defines us as humans, then having a moral code that's grounded in an ideal of reason, rather than alienating us from ourselves, might actually complete ourselves, might make us more ourselves than we were before, right? Submitting to reason and letting reason be our guide might actually be a way of, even though that can be really demanding, the demands, if we submit to them, make us more human, more fully human than we were before. Or alternatively, a virtue ethical theory, which we're going to be looking at right at the end of semester, says that, again, it can make really stringent demands on us, but the source of the demands are the virtues: courage, kindness, generosity, temperance. And the virtues, for a virtue theorist, are those very things that we need in order to live well as human beings. So the claim is going to be, from critics of consequentialism, yes, all ethical theories are super demanding, but it really matters the way that the demands come to us. And consequentialism, the way that it issues its demands to us, runs a greater threat of alienating ourselves from our true selves. Now, whether that's fair is something that we'll hopefully be in a better position to judge after we've spent a bit more time looking at deontology and virtue theory. So we'll come back to this at the end of the semester. Was there anything I wanted to mention about assessment? No, I don't think so. Sorry. All right. Thanks very much for that. A moment of absent-mindedness at the end there. I'll see you all next week. Cheers. Yeah, I think that's possibly fair. Do you want to expand on that? Thinking that ends justify the means is kind of turns us all into empty ciphers and something like a corporate agenda.
Yeah, we need to be able to push our own moral perspective back. If we're just accepting the playing field, that the powers that be set.
Yeah, I think that's quite like some contemporary critics of consequentialism who are focusing on which I
Yes, I think that would be some of the extra readings. They're really worried about this. They're worried. Sounds good. See ya. Can't end up inadvertently stabilising and legitimising that system. And it's better to be a country
Yeah, it's good to be back.
than someone who,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, stabilises the system.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
Yo, what's the second? The guy who wrote the second reading with Brink. You know, you had the slide with him.
Do you know what? I should just take my thing off
Yeah,
the
go,
screen.
no
Sorry
rush.
about
It
that.
just takes me a little while to get set up.
Okay, sorry, I just forgot that I
You
hadn't done
don't
that
go
yet.